How does a president, already sinking in popularity, fire a living god? At 1 o'clock in the morning on April 11, 1951, the lights in the White House press room burned with an unnatural urgency. A small group of reporters, hastily pulled from their beds, gathered for a piece of news that would send shockwaves across the United States and reverberate around the world. President Harry S. Truman, a man many saw as just an accidental placeholder, had done the unthinkable. He had fired General of the Army Douglas MacArthur, the hero of the Pacific, the conqueror of Japan, the man many Americans considered their greatest living citizen. The announcement was met with stunned silence, then a frantic dash to the phones. The next morning, the nation awoke to headlines that screamed betrayal and outrage. How could a plain-spoken president from Missouri dare to strike down an American icon and plunge a fractured world into a third, and potentially nuclear, world war? This is the story of that decision, a story of ego, duty, and the constitutional line that cannot be crossed. If you believe stories like this, where history is forged in the choices of powerful individuals, are important, please consider subscribing to our channel, liking this video, and sharing it with someone who needs to hear the story. And be sure to let us know in the comments what you find most surprising about the events that follow. To understand the explosion, you first have to understand the two men destined to collide. The first was President Harry S. Truman. If you were to design a president in a lab to be the polar opposite of General MacArthur, you'd end up with Harry Truman. He wasn't born into greatness, he clawed his way toward it. Born in Lamar, Missouri, he was a farmer, a World War I artillery captain who earned the fierce loyalty of his men, and a failed haberdasher whose Kansas City shop went bankrupt. His entry into politics came through the less-than-pristine Pendergast political machine, a fact his opponents never let him forget. Then, in 1944, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, seeking a fourth term, needed a new vice president. Party bosses settled on the unassuming senator from Missouri as a safe choice. On April 12, 1945, just 82 days into his vice presidency, Truman was summoned to the White House. Eleanor Roosevelt placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Harry, the president is dead." Truman's world, and the world itself, turned on its axis. He later told reporters, "I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." He was now commander-in-chief, stepping into the shoes of a political giant. Where FDR was patrician, Truman was plain-spoken and direct. He lacked Roosevelt's charisma, but beneath that simple exterior was unshakable resolve. On his desk sat a famous sign, a gift mailed to him on October 2, 1945, that became his philosophy: "The buck stops here." For Harry Truman, there was no hiding. The final decision, however unpopular, was his. The other half of this collision course was General Douglas MacArthur. Where Truman was grounded, MacArthur was theatrical and utterly convinced of his own destiny. His father was a lieutenant general. MacArthur himself graduated first in his class at West Point, embarking on a military career that seemed a preordained path to glory. During World War II, his dramatic pledge upon leaving the Philippines, "I shall return," became a national rallying cry. He was a brilliant strategist, but also a master of public relations. The signature corncob pipe, the sunglasses, the imperious tone were all part of a carefully crafted persona. He wasn't just a general, he was MacArthur. After the war, his stature grew as the de facto ruler of occupied Japan, where he governed with the authority of an emperor. His success inflated an already legendary ego. He lived in a bubble of near-constant adulation and had come to see himself as more than a soldier. He was a political force, a hero who, in the eyes of millions, could do no wrong. This deep well of public adoration made him believe he was untouchable. By 1950, the Cold War was turning hot. After World War II, Korea was divided at the 38th parallel. The Soviets backed a communist regime in the north under Kim Il-sung, and the U.S. supported a republic in the south. On June 25, 1950, backed by Soviet tanks, the North Korean People's Army stormed across the border. The South Korean army collapsed. In Washington, Truman saw the invasion as a direct challenge from Moscow, a test of American resolve. He committed U.S. forces under the banner of a United Nations police action. The man to lead this UN command was, of course, General Douglas MacArthur. But the situation was catastrophic. UN forces were in a desperate retreat, clinging to a tiny pocket of land on the southeastern tip of the peninsula, the Pusan perimeter. It looked like they would be pushed into the sea. For the American Caesar, it was a moment of supreme crisis, but also of supreme opportunity. Trapped in the Pusan perimeter, Washington was grim. But MacArthur wasn't thinking about defense. He conjured a masterstroke, a massive amphibious landing hundreds of miles behind enemy lines at the port of Incheon. From there, he could retake the capital, Seoul, and sever the North Korean army's supply lines. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were horrified. Incheon had colossal tidal variations, a narrow channel, and high seawalls. It was a commander's worst nightmare. MacArthur, in a display of pure theatrical genius, argued that the very difficulty of Incheon was its greatest advantage. The enemy would never expect it. Truman, trusting his general, gave the green light. On September 15, 1950, the gamble paid off spectacularly. U.S. Marines swarmed over the seawalls, securing the port. Within 2 weeks, Seoul was liberated, and the North Korean army disintegrated. It was a miraculous victory, and MacArthur, the man who willed it into existence, was now a military prophet. His prestige soared. He had been right when everyone else was wrong. The stunning success at Incheon changed the war. The original goal was simply to restore the border at the 38th parallel. But in the glow of victory, a new, more ambitious goal took shape: the reunification of Korea. MacArthur was its most forceful advocate. In early October, Truman authorized MacArthur to cross the 38th parallel, but with a critical warning: do not provoke China. If there was any sign of major Chinese intervention, MacArthur was to halt. China's premier, Zhou Enlai, issued increasingly blunt warnings that China would not stand by and allow an American army to march to its border on the Yalu River. MacArthur dismissed it all as a bluff. He assured Truman the chances of Chinese intervention were minimal, and the war would be over by Christmas. As MacArthur's forces pushed deep into North Korea, Washington grew uneasy. Truman, who had never met his famous commander, decided it was time for a face-to-face. A meeting was arranged on a tiny spit of land in the Pacific, Wake Island. On October 15, 1950, the presidential plane touched down. The President of the United States had flown thousands of miles. MacArthur, whose headquarters was closer, made him wait. When he finally approached, he was dressed informally and greeted his commander-in-chief not with a salute, but a casual handshake. To Truman, who revered the office, it was a sign of disrespect. The real subject was China. Truman asked his general directly, "What are the chances of Chinese or Soviet interference?" MacArthur's response was unequivocal. The opportunity for Chinese intervention, he said, had passed. He claimed only 50,000 to 60,000 Chinese troops could make it across the Yalu River. "We are no longer fearful of their intervention," he declared. "If the Chinese dared to cross," he boasted, "there would be the greatest slaughter." Truman, wanting to believe the good news, left Wake Island reassured. He had no idea that at that very moment, hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteer soldiers were already secretly streaming across the Yalu River. The handshake on the tarmac was the last time the two men would ever see each other. This story is a powerful reminder of how personal conviction and public perception can shape the course of history. If you are finding this narrative compelling and want to support our deep dives into the past, please take a moment to subscribe and like the video. It helps us continue to bring these critical stories to light. Now, share this video with someone who might not know the full story, and comment below with the one detail that has stood out to you the most so far. After Wake Island, a confident MacArthur launched his Home by Christmas offensive, a final push to the Yalu River. In late October, UN forces made their first contact with Chinese soldiers, but MacArthur's headquarters downplayed the incidents. Then, on the night of November 25, 1950, the dragon awoke. An estimated 300,000 Chinese soldiers slammed into the overextended UN lines in a massive, coordinated assault. The eerie sound of Chinese bugles in the frozen night heralded a total disaster. The UN's Eighth Army was sent reeling backwards in what would become the longest retreat in American military history. The X-Corps, including a division of U.S. Marines, was surrounded at the Chosin Reservoir, where they fought one of the most brutal battles in military history, battling not just the enemy but also temperatures plunging to 30 degrees below zero. The Home by Christmas offensive had become a desperate fight for survival. MacArthur, the infallible genius, had been dealt a catastrophic defeat. But in his messages back to Washington, he accepted no blame. Instead, He framed the disaster as a betrayal by politicians who had tied his hands, forbidding him from bombing Chinese sanctuaries across the Yalu. China's entry into the war fundamentally changed Truman's calculations. This was now about preventing World War III. A full-scale war with China could trigger its defense pact with the Soviet Union, sparking a global nuclear conflict. Truman's new strategy was a limited war, with the goal of a negotiated settlement. To MacArthur, the concept was heresy. It was appeasement. He began aggressively lobbying for a dramatic escalation, a blockade of the Chinese coast, bombing Manchuria, and even requesting the authority to use atomic bombs at his own discretion. Horrified, Truman and the Joint Chiefs issued a clear directive in December 1950. All public statements about the war had to be cleared by the State Department first. It was a gag order aimed squarely at one man. MacArthur chose to defy it, complaining to journalists about the unprecedented military restrictions placed on him. The final act of insubordination came in March 1951. House Republican leader Joseph Martin wrote to MacArthur, and the general wrote back a scathing reply, ending with a line that was a direct slap at the president. "There is," MacArthur wrote, "no substitute for victory." Knowing exactly what he was doing, MacArthur didn't mark the letter as confidential. On April 5, Congressman Martin read the general's letter aloud on the floor of the House. A five-star general, in wartime, had publicly sided with the opposition party to condemn the president's strategy. The line had been obliterated. When news of the Martin letter reached the White House, Truman was filled with a quiet, cold fury. This was the last straw, a direct challenge to the principle of civilian control of the military. Years later, Truman put it bluntly, "I fired him because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president." But the decision wasn't made in anger. Truman gathered his senior advisors, Secretary of State Dean Acheson, Secretary of Defense George Marshall, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, led by General Omar Bradley. The consensus was clear. MacArthur had to go. It was General Bradley who famously summarized their view, later testifying that MacArthur's strategy would involve us in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. With his advisors in agreement, the final decision rested on Truman's shoulders. He knew the political cost would be immense, but he also knew his constitutional duty. The American Caesar had to be relieved. The plan was to relieve MacArthur respectfully, but a leak forced the White House to act quickly. The blunt order was transmitted over public wires to Tokyo, and MacArthur reportedly learned he'd been fired from his wife, who heard it on the radio. On the night of April 11, 1951, just hours after the 1 a.m. press announcement, Harry Truman addressed the American people. He sat at his desk and delivered a calm, deliberate explanation. "In the simplest of terms," he said, "what we are doing in Korea is this: we are trying to prevent a third world war." He then addressed MacArthur with measured respect, calling him one of our greatest military commanders. But he pivoted to the constitutional crisis. "A number of events have made it evident that General MacArthur did not agree with that policy," Truman stated plainly. "I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy." The core of his message was institutional, not personal. "The cause of world peace is more important than any single individual," he declared. The storm, when it broke, was a political hurricane. The public reaction was apoplectic. Telegrams flooded congressional offices, with sentiment running 20-1 against the president. Across the country, Truman was burned in effigy. His approval rating plummeted to a dismal 22%. MacArthur, meanwhile, returned to a blaze of glory, greeted by some of the largest crowds in American history. The climax came on April 19, 1951, when he addressed a joint session of Congress. In a masterful and deeply emotional speech, he defended his strategy and then, bringing his address to a dramatic close, quoted an old army ballad. "I am closing my 52 years of military service," he said. "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away. And like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away. Goodbye." There was a stunned silence, followed by a deafening ovation. Many in the chamber were openly weeping. It seemed MacArthur had won. But the judgment of history is often different from the heat of the moment. The Senate launched joint hearings into the firing, beginning in May 1951. MacArthur was the star witness, but then the administration had its turn. One by one, Truman's senior advisors, Atchison, Marshall, and the Joint Chiefs, came to testify. Their testimony, delivered behind closed doors but later released, systematically dismantled MacArthur's case. They explained, in stark detail, the enormous risks of his proposals, including the very real threat of a Third World War. General Bradley's testimony was particularly powerful, painting MacArthur's strategy not as bold, but as reckless. The quiet, professional testimony of the nation's top military officers, all supporting their civilian commander-in-chief, slowly began to turn the tide. As the hearings unfolded, the war in Korea, under MacArthur's capable successor General Matthew Ridgway, stabilized around the 38th parallel. MacArthur's political star fizzled, and he began to fade away. This was more than a clash of two titanic egos. It was a fundamental crossroads in American history. It was a test of the U.S. Constitution itself. In the short term, Truman paid a heavy price. His popularity never fully recovered. But in the long run, his decision has been completely vindicated by historians, who regard it as one of the most courageous and important acts of his presidency. He affirmed, at great personal cost, the unshakable principle of civilian control over the military and stopped a regional conflict from escalating into a potential nuclear holocaust. The story of that late-night decision is of a quiet, stubborn man from Missouri who, faced with a crisis that threatened to tear the country apart, accepted the public scorn to uphold his oath, proving that in the American system, the law is more powerful than any general. If you were as captivated by this story of duty and defiance as we were, ensure you are subscribed and have liked the video so you don't miss our next historical deep dive. We encourage you to share this video with others who appreciate history, and to leave a comment below with something new you've learned. Thank you for watching.